Do you want to learn more on how to put money to work in regenerative food and agriculture? Follow our video course via investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/course or in the links below. Now, on to the podcast. If landowners and stewards could visualize what regeneration would look like on their land, what options they have in their context, plus the financial and environmental and social benefits it would yield, would that kickstart the landscape regeneration movement? Is visualization, the potential of landscape scale regeneration, the missing puzzle piece? And what about the enormous carbon arbitrage opportunities which exist or will exist between very degraded land and their prices compared to carbon income or the potential carbon income of regeneration? How do we make sure that we don't get an enormous speculative boom which leaves the current stewards of the land worse off? Tempering climate change, bringing back rivers, preventing floods, and obviously lots and lots of nutrient-dense food. The promises of Regen Ag often sounds straight out of a science fiction book. And for these promises to be met, we need to significantly scale regeneration to a landscape scale within this decade. Welcome to a new series where we look into the technologies needed to bring regeneration to a landscape scale. In this series, we'll look at already existing technologies, digital tech, ag tech, new financing mechanisms, etc. that can scale fast enough during the next 10 years. Technologies which put significantly more money into the pockets of farmers, landowners and land stewards who are regenerating their and our soils so they can go faster. And we'll ask the question, what is missing? What needs to be urgently developed over the next years? We're very happy with the support for this series by the Grantham Environmental Trust, which supports strategic communications and collaboration in solving the world's most pressing environmental problems. You can find out more at granthamfoundation.org. In March last year, we launched our membership community, make it easy for fans to support our work, and so many of you have joined as a member. We've launched different types of benefits, exclusive content, Q&A webinars with former guests, Ask Me Anything sessions, plus so much more to come in the future. For more information on the different tiers, benefits and how to become a member, check gumroad.com/investinregenag or find the link below. Thank you. Welcome to another episode, today with Earthshot Labs, working on measuring global ecosystems to support incentivizing land regeneration for climate change mitigation, thriving human civilization, and to preserve nature for its own sake. Welcome, Troy and Patrick.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And as always, to start with a personal question, how did both of you, but let's start with Troy, end up in soil or on soil and working on regeneration, also beyond soil, but let's start with soil.
Yeah. So this is Troy. I don't think I'm particularly unique in this time because, let's face it, the climate crisis and ecological collapse is the largest theme of this decade. Ask any 14-year-old some of the things that they care about, and climate change might be pretty high on the list. So, my background, the previous company that I started is Rhizome. We're pioneering large-scale reforestation and bamboo-engineered lumber in the Philippines. And through the process of operating that company, we really identified some very broken aspects of carbon markets and other ways in which we try to incentivize landowners to do the right thing on land. And Earthshot was born out of a mission to do ecological restoration at a planetary scale. And so Patrick and I came together to identify high leverage points to use technology to help that happen.
And what about you, Patrick?
Well, I came into this realm of ecological restoration a lot later than Troy. So I have a long background in technology, both at Google as well as within the environment of an investment fund, figuring out ways to use data science and machine learning to make better investments. And then when Troy and I met, it was a really interesting synergy between our experiences. On his side for regenerative agriculture and bamboo-based lumber, and then on my side with data science applied in large-scale investing and technology environments. And I just realized that I had all these skills and valuable experiences and connections, and I felt a real strong calling to actually apply them in service of the planet and in service of restoring nature. So I think that really came out in the last couple of years as being something I wanted to dedicate my life to.
And then you mentioned, Troy, you were going through an exercise of figuring out what are the biggest nodes in the system where leverage can be applied, what is missing there. What did that process look like? And how did you get to where you're now, which we'll, of course, talk about, but I'm always interested in that prioritization phase and figuring out, okay, what do you choose to focus your time and energy on, which is a huge question I get from a lot of people. Okay, I would like to work in regeneration and work in regen ag, but where should I focus if I'm not a farmer?
Yeah. So I would say Earthshot was born out of Patrick and I's, like, our conversations that we just had every day or every week for the last year and a half. And the problem space was really clear. We want to address the climate crisis with holistic nature-based solutions because nature needs to be restored for its own sake, as well as has holistic benefits and is the foundation of true wealth for all humans. So we want to encourage nature. So how do we do that? We identified a few key steps in that process that we were uniquely positioned to address. The first step was measurement. Basically, if you can measure it, then we can incentivize for action or behavior or policy. So the first step we came up with was, let's create an accurate model of the relevant global ecosystems, including forests, soil, water, and now we're working on biodiversity, or will be soon. So to start, we started a Slack community and invited about 50 of our friends to spend a month together. And it's like, okay, hey, let's see if we can give it a go at creating and using existing academic literature and satellite imagery and machine learning to see what we can do in a month. And after about a month, we hit the cutting edge of science quite quickly and said, okay, we've got something here. Let's keep going.
And that was that model that you mentioned to identify ecosystems, or what was that cutting edge that you felt, okay, now we're getting to something juicy?
So that was basically looking at the existing academic literature in above ground biomass forecasting, in statistical modeling of soil carbon, and of water restoration interventions. And in each of these categories, we realized that either the academics had great models that were never actually applied in any product, or that the academic models actually didn't bring into account satellite imagery from the last years, or modern machine learning methods to actually extrapolate that satellite imagery in a useful way across the entire globe. So we essentially took existing academic literature and extended it using additional data sources and additional methods.
And that was in a month. And then what made you, I mean, that's, I would say it's a nice side project, or it's nice, okay, these are the limits, or this is the potential. But then you didn't stop there and you started pushing.
Yeah, I think the vision caught us. And what the vision was the second step of the problem, which we're calling LandOS. And it's how to give every landowner on Earth, every policymaker, every investor, the ability to visualize tangibly what will happen to their land if they do regenerative interventions, and then viewing individual actions and the possibilities that unfold when they're applied across an entire landscape or continent level. We basically got caught by the vision where this is one of the biggest ideas on Earth right now, where land use is a major contributor to climate change, but it can also be the biggest solution. At least 2/3 of climate solutions will be driven by regenerative land use and nature-based solutions. And so the possibility of a grand unified ecosystem model is now actually realistic. And another thing is the level of cultural will that we saw among volunteer open source contributors to the data aspect of this project. Now we have about 1,000 members in the community, and this has grown so fast and in a way that we have been blessed by the most brilliant world-class people we've ever met, that are heart-centered, that have a deep care for the planet, have a deep care for ecosystems, have a deep care for people in developing countries, a holistic view of what this crisis actually is. And we've been so impressed by people volunteering their time and creating a sort of organizational culture that we've never seen before. So it's been hugely validating and exciting.
And Patrick, can you walk us through how LandOS would work? As I'm a landowner, and I think it's one of the issues, and we can discuss more about how that is actually neglected at the moment, like to be able to visualize and to see the potential of an ecosystem, a piece of land, or a large piece of land, small piece of land, like what is actually possible, as we're so used to the current state and the current state of going slowly down or fast in some cases. Like how would it be me wearing VR glasses? Would it be me looking at a computer screen? What would I actually see and feel and touch and smell when I see the potential? Obviously choosing different things and different levels and different, what would it be like?
Sure. I think the first step is definitely outreach. Like the idea would be that we would sort of already analyze the landowner or the farmer's land and give them some kind of form of outreach where we'd say, hey, we think that we could add this much value to your land. Grab them, have them click through to our tool. And there they can see basically here is the kind of current status of where things are. And here are what, as far as your land's current sort of economic potential, as far as its current use, and essentially give them like kind of a detailed view that our models currently say as far as groundwater, as far as current soil organic carbon, as far as above ground biomass and carbon estimations.
And just for my information, this is possible now around the globe for any piece of land, or is it limited to where you have certain data sources?
Yeah. So we have some models that are already global in scope, and we have other models that are more localized because of the limitations of ground data, and we're looking to really overcome those limitations. But it seems like every month there's some new data set that arrives that gives us a different piece of the puzzle. Like we just recently made contact with a group called OpenGeoHub based in Europe, and they have the most amazing soil data set that they spent a lot of time preparing and aligning amongst a bunch of different sort of source data sets. And so we thought we'd have to do that ourselves, but because both groups are open source, all of the research we're doing and that they're doing is open source, we can just share data, and they've saved us many, many months of effort to put that data set together.
And where does it touch on the agriculture piece? Like, do you already have models on the silvopasture side? Like, this is a cattle rancher that, in your example, maybe doesn't want to stop completely with cattle ranching, maybe wants to actually switch to regenerative practices. Does that get complicated very fast? Like, okay, where are you going to plant the trees compared to certain grass types, etc.? Or how does it look like in your vision?
Yeah, definitely. It's our intention to be able to provide different regenerative agricultural scenarios to be played out in the simulator. Agriculture is a lot more complex because it does involve, kind of harvesting multiple crops and figuring out the interplay between those crops. We are partnering with several groups that are really versant in regenerative agriculture, including Climate Farmers in Europe and including Regen Network over here in the US. I would say that's likely to be a subsequent kind of version of LandOS. Like we'll start off with some of the kind of relatively more simple interventions like straight up reforestation and various forms of water restoration. And then we'll move on to the more complex cases like regenerative agriculture once we have more on the ground experience and once we have a platform that really works for those initial use cases.
And so what is the potential? I think it's a very interesting in this time. We're recording this in the summer of 2021, where it seems half the world is on fire and the other half is flooding away. Plus, I don't know how many fires in the US, plus many others that I'm probably not aware of because the news seems to be too full. Do you see that providing that visual, what could be, is that the key? Was that, or is that the missing link compared to all the other things you could be doing with this data as well to provide it to policymakers, etc.? Like, do you see that landowners don't see the potential yet and thus nothing is happening? Or why did you focus so much, or are you focusing so much on that? Visualizing and seeing the vision of a piece of land.
Yeah, maybe I can chime in on that. The first thing is, it's not just the visualization, it's all of it, right? It's the financial case, it's the level of perceived and actual risk, it's the emotional connection to a truly restored piece of land, it's seeing the value. So let's talk about a couple of specific use cases, for example. Southern Portugal is a seasonally arid environment. There's plenty of rain in the winter, and it's a very hot, dry summer. And it looks like a desert. And the reason it looks like a desert is because the water cycle is broken. And to restore the water cycle, building small earthen dams, swales, and tiny stream check dams would slow down the water cycle, provide enough water throughout the summer to do revegetation in a way that would restore that to being a completely forested environment. That would change the economics of forestry. That would change the economics of agriculture of Portugal. And it would dramatically change like this total, like what the ecosystem actually looks like. What we actually perceive is a desert actually isn't a desert or doesn't have to be a desert. Think of another use case in Australia. Cattle stocking rates have been going down and down and down. And now most of Australia is considered like a completely barren desert with some massive, massive flash floods that have wiped away a lot of topsoil. That doesn't have to be the case. And so now this land, which is considered somewhere like $50 or $100 an acre, something like ridiculously low valued in terms of agricultural productivity, actually has a much higher value if the water cycles slowed down with revegetation and reforestation, where the carbon sequestration value is actually much, much higher than the current agricultural value of the land, based on techniques that have never been applied at a landscape level algorithmically. Another case study, one of my friends, Regenerative Singh, he's this very brilliant man called the Water Gandhi in India, restored 7 rivers in Rajasthan by assembling 100,000 people and building these small earthen interventions and shallow injection wells, really using shovels and people power. And that restored the livelihoods and economic vitality of a region for tens of millions of people based on the restoration of water cycles. So we know it's possible. We can imagine that these techniques can be applied at landscape level all across the world, but we need to show a compelling simulation to policymakers. For example, California. How do we solve the California water crisis? We need to provide a compelling simulation to landowners and policymakers so that they can actually go make the decisions and understand what the effects will be 2 and 10 and 30 years down the road.
Because that's what you feel that's missing, like the swales and keyline design and many other of these practices have been around for a long time, in many cases for centuries. We've all seen it at permaculture courses. We've seen it applied at farms with amazing results. And I think many of us have also imagined what would happen if we apply this to a watershed. The issue is, or what you're describing is, we're only able to imagine it, but not to actually simulate it and to say, okay, what would happen on a watershed level if we apply swales at the right place, at the right time, and what happens 10 years down the line, or 15 or 20, et cetera, et cetera. That's the missing, making the imagination tangible seems to be the missing link, is what you're saying.
Yeah, part of it. And part of it is also the fact that many, many companies and efforts in this space, including private governments, NGOs, institutions, carbon is a big focus right now, and for good reason, because
it's interesting because you're talking about carbon and then we
switch to water, right?
Yeah. So talk about that.
So it's all one problem. And we can't be too reductionistic in making it a problem about there being too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Yes, that is a proximate, immediate issue that we need to address. And so we can build large machines, we can do all these innovative pathways to take that carbon dioxide and put it into other forms. But even if we had a magic wand and we're able to do that right now, we would still be left with a crisis of thousands of species going extinct, of unprecedented disruptions in small water cycles and in very large water cycles, in these mass scale weather patterns. And so this is not just a problem with CO2, it's a problem of ecosystems losing balance. And so the fundamental places where we need to understand ecosystems are in water cycles, are in soil, and are in forests, and also in biodiversity, which for us is sort of an indicator of just general health of the ecosystem. And so we don't know of any other initiative that is taking as comprehensive of an approach and then actually applying solutions. So yes, carbon is something that we can measure and get paid for so that there's a direct incentive to the landowner to do an intervention. That's really important. But just as important is that we actually solve the real crisis, which is imbalanced ecosystems. So in the process of having a landowner get paid for carbon, we also want to start introducing metrics around water, around biodiversity, and around soil health that support long-term wealth for the landowner, support regenerative livelihoods so that agricultural production or agroforestry or forestry can continue in a way that provides multi-generational incomes. And then it's also other issues, right? This is about indigenous land agency and climate justice and inclusivity of how
And ownership.
and ownership.
Because you keep talking about landowners.
Right? Who owns land? Right?
What is your, I wouldn't say, what's your feeling about that? Like,
Yeah.
Some people say land ownership is the biggest underlying reason we are, private land ownership are in many of these different messes. What is your feeling there as you're working with many of them?
I mean, this is a really deep theme because people who live on land and have lived on that piece of land for many generations tend to really love it. They feel connected. They have cultural history, stories, direct, intimate connection with that place. So people who have that sort of connection don't just go around chopping down the forest. That's not actually why forests get chopped down. They get chopped down because of economic stresses that are placed upon those people with that connection, because of food security, because of a change in legal land ownership that disenfranchises the people that are actually there. So there are many, many issues, and I don't have a one-line solution to the problem of the complexity of land ownership and remote land ownership and land ownership by very large institutions or governments that don't have the best interests of a particular place or people in their incentive structure. But what we can do is say we have a strong intention and belief that designing proper incentive structures can actually reward land stewardship in a beautiful way. And that will require 1,000 tiny product decisions over the course of the coming decades that we can't plan on, that we can't codify right now. All we can do is build the advisory network, build the feedback systems with local people so that our product can actually take them into account constantly, versus essentially a colonial mindset where we think that Land OS will provide these people the answer. What we are doing is providing a feedback loop where we can take local knowledge and support the elements of the value chain that need to scale. For example, carbon credit markets. It's really hard to get on a carbon credit market right now for someone who doesn't have much internet access, or doesn't have $500,000 to pay professional consultants, or doesn't have the technological knowledge. So we need to solve the parts of the chain that are ours to solve, and then provide inputs from indigenous and local wisdom of people who've been doing it in that area for centuries or millennia.
I think I could just add to that a little bit and just say, I think one of the underlying basic problems we have is that our economy doesn't really value the things that should be valued, including biodiversity, including the groundwater, including soil itself and its quality. These are all things that we derive massive economic benefit from and whose lack results in catastrophe. And with the exception of carbon, which is something that we're sort of emitting more into the atmosphere that pushes things out of balance, we started to kind of recognize that removing carbon from the current state of the atmosphere is a good thing and of value, as of economic value. But there's a whole host of other things that we're starting to see progress on, and we're looking to push on this as well. Like if you look at, for instance, Regen Network's Carbon Plus initiative, where they're looking to kind of start to recognize the value of the co-benefits of biodiversity and soil health and water and so on. So this is a necessary shift where we really do recognize, yes, these are things that are worth preserving, these are things that are worth restoring. And to your question about the land ownership, there's different views on this, but I think that the fact that people who sort of quote own land feel that they can do whatever they want with that land, that's essentially led to a lot of problems as well. So I think that valuing things that are clearly of immense value to humanity but are currently not recognized, and treating the land with respect, connecting with it in a way that's more like the way that indigenous peoples connect with their land, with the land that they have stewardship over in their ancestral, areas, would go a long way towards preventing the kind of mess that we're in today.
So let's talk about the carbon arbitrage, which you called in your last newsletter. Doesn't showing the potential of these places and this degraded land where many won't see any potential because it just seems like a desert, like you called, but actually doesn't have to be, could also trigger an enormous gold rush to buying up these places as soon as possible for the lowest price possible, and then doing some of the work maybe, or just hoping for somebody else to show up and buy it from slightly more. Like it could also lead to speculation, which maybe isn't a bad thing if we want to fix a lot of these things, but somehow always feels like a bad thing. Because as more people wake up to the potential of regenerative practices at a landscape scale, that's why we're running this series, there will be much more interest from a lot of people looking for maybe some quick money, which I don't think there's in RegenAg in general, but looking for some ways to get in on it without doing all the hard work.
So I'll let you in on a secret. The reason we're doing Earthshot is not to solve climate change. The fundamental reason why we're doing it is because we love nature, and we love nature for its own sake and believe that beautiful, ancient, biodiverse landscapes should exist. And so in a way, we're using the opportunity of crisis to address an issue that we believe in anyway. And so let's take this in the process of transitioning land values from a degraded landscape to a landscape with potential very high carbon sequestration value. There will be a lot of unintended consequences, same as there will be a lot of unintended consequences for
the big machines sucking carbon. Yeah.
Yes.
Or anything else we do. Yeah.
Anything else, including measurement. What we measure will determine incentive structures. And when we incentivize something, for example, carbon sequestration, if we wanted to sequester all the carbon the fastest, we would probably plant a lot of bamboo everywhere on Earth, billions and billions of acres, and probably end up with a monoculture. And so on the surface, hey, that's a really good thing. Climate change solved. And what we're left with might not be the ecosystem that sustains in every region. Like the level of resilience and biodiversity could go down, even to the level of soil microorganisms, which we have a very shallow understanding of, the trillions of different little microorganisms that are just as complex as human life on Earth. We don't know the effect of interventions like that. So unintended consequences around local people losing land agency from institutional buyers or governments coming in and purchasing land is a real issue. We don't know whether it's good or bad for large institutions to go purchase undervalued land. I think it will happen. It's inevitable that it will happen when land prices change and people see what we think is probably a more than $5 trillion carbon land arbitrage over the coming couple decades.
And this is based on modeling. This is not just like you putting a number up.
Right. So based on land that is currently valued anywhere between $50 and $2,000 an acre, some of that land could go as high as $5,000 an acre in terms of carbon sequestration value. And that's based on biomass growth rates in tropical areas. That's based on different agroforestry products like bamboo that have very high carbon sequestration rates and also fairly high agricultural returns from, mixed cash crops like Brazil nuts and coffee and chocolate. And also the reality of rising carbon prices. 2 years ago, carbon markets were in a very different place than they are now. Now there's massive, massive demand, particularly for nature-based carbon removals. And so the price of those is $10 now. Maybe next year it'll be $15. Maybe in the future years, we're already seeing regulatory markets in Canada, in Scandinavia, and throughout the EU in particular, pricing carbon as high as $50 a ton over the coming years. So
yeah, we had Jim Mann of the Future Forest Company on that is selling on the voluntary markets, but especially around, there is a market of like the edgy stuff around biochar and enhanced weathering, selling to Stripe for, I think around biochar was $50 a ton and then weathering $200. So there is, how big that market is a second, but there's definitely also on the voluntary side, a market that pays and pays really, really well to a certain level and limit. And for sure, they are all hoping, of course, the market comes down. That's why Stripe is doing that. But until now, it seems like there's a lot more hunger out there than there is actually supply.
Yeah, definitely.
I think you're making a good point, though. Any system in which people get rewarded for doing certain things, human beings will try to game it. It's just, that's kind of one of the facts of life. And we've already seen that in carbon markets as well, with people trying to kind of shift projects around and organize them in such a way that they're compliant with certain methodologies, but there's actually not as much net gain across the whole of their portfolios of forestry or of land use than they might seem. And so we're already seeing there are investors out there that are a little bit gun shy about some of the projects that are out there and all of this kind of carbon sequestration that's going on, because there are people already gaming the system. And so this is a moving frontier, right? I mean, we are in the voluntary markets, especially. It's undergoing a period of great change where there's a lot of new technology coming in, a lot of new methodologies. And we want to lead by example. We want to jump in there and actually show people this is the way to do this. This is the way to develop land in such a way that we can restore nature, we can generate decent returns and create economic value while also doing things in a responsible way that results in an ecosystem that's actually good for the planet and is good for the people that live on it. And I think that'll go a long way towards helping to set a bar there as far as here's the way that this should be done in a holistic way that's good for everyone and good for the animals and the beings on the land, as well as for us, the humans that essentially sort of are the stewards of that land.
So what's next for Land OS? And you mentioned a number of case studies. What is next for this project or for Earth Labs and Earthshot Labs in general to make it more concrete, to get swales in and to move water in a different way, etc.?
Sure. So I'll tell you where we are now. Right now, we have 5 project teams, 3 research teams, and 2 product teams. So the research teams are the soil team, the forest team, and the water team, and we'll be expanding into biodiversity soon. And these teams are a consortium of international academics, different institutions, data scientists, software engineers, pretty much all volunteers contributing to a coherent global way of measuring ecosystems. For us, that's a very important step. If we can agree as a globe on how to measure things in a peer-reviewed, rigorous process where everyone can see the methods, that's a very, very powerful tool to unlock products. The Land OS and Biome teams are doing something pretty cool, and we'll have a product release in the coming months. And Land OS, the first iteration, will be viewing ecosystem and regenerative interventions that anyone on Earth can see what to do with their land to optimize for ecological regeneration and profitability. But we're also developing something we're calling carbon as a service. So rather than going through a very complex process of onboarding carbon credits, our system will have remote verification plus crowdsourced on-the-ground site observations to generate a carbon credit on a blockchain-based system. And the way we're doing carbon verification is a bit unique than what happens right now. What happens right now is that a professional verifier comes through, spends a year on feasibility studies and project documentation, charges a few $100,000, and sends an auditor through to actually go collect biomass samples using a tape measure and then allometric equations for the species on the ground. A lot of those steps can be automated, and a lot of them can actually be more accurate when taken through on-the-ground observations. So we're developing an app called Biome, and it's essentially a way to collect LiDAR from modern iPhones, as well as pictures of trees to identify more accurately site observation data, and in a way that costs the landowner nothing. So going from $500,000 and 2 years to a very fast process that takes a few hours and is free for the landowner to onboard carbon credits is a much more scalable proposition. And so that's sort of the first stage, is in the next 6 months, releasing the Land OS plus Biome system for onboarding carbon credits and providing landowner recommendations. Also within the next 6 months, we'll be starting our first pilot project for doing actual on-the-ground reforestation and land restoration operations. And this is not something that, we've gotten a lot of pushback on this as well. It's like, hey, this is not something a tech company is supposed to do. You're not supposed to go actually put trees in the ground. That's something that a non-scalable operator should do. And what we realized is that we need to learn a lot. So we've partnered with people from the largest reforestation organizations in the world to lead our first pilot project and develop a reforestation methodology and playbook on how to do reforestation and land restoration using best practices from decades of reforestation operations, as well as local site-specific wisdom. And automating the parts of the process can be automated, providing scale to parts of the process that need scale. So, for example, nursery, planting operations, irrigation, and then allowing for site-specific variations among tree species selection, among pioneering or timing based on plantings.
And do you have any idea where the pilot will happen? Because
yes, we do.
I mean, really, which, if you cannot name a site, obviously, but which area of the world are we talking about?
So we're looking at sites right now in Panama and Mexico as places that we have deeply trusted on-the-ground partners to work with and landowners that are very willing, and a lot of will from local government to actually make this happen. So those will be our areas for initial pilots. And then we essentially want to build a reforestation playbook and are in the process of building one where we can catalyze 1,000 different project developers around the world to do reforestation at scale using LandOS and Biome as monitoring and verification technology, and the other technological planning and processes that are needed for an operator to go do tens of thousands of hectares of reforestation and have the economic incentive structures for maintaining it and paying for it, and the organizational capacity to actually go implement and have thousands or tens of thousands of employees actually doing that.
And what is missing? I like to ask this question of a magic wand. Like, if you have a magic wand, if you could change one thing in the food and ag system, but I want to adjust it a bit here in terms of tech, as you are a tech company. Like, what would you really wish that tomorrow morning would exist in your playbook, in your data set, or anywhere else in terms of technology? What is missing currently to get regeneration to a landscape or an ecosystem or a watershed scale?
Patrick and I might have different answers, so I'm curious what he says. For me, measurement is still the fundamental problem right now. So what I would wish for is a comprehensive understanding of small and large water cycles on land so that we can provide specific algorithmic recommendations for every single swale, check dam, injection well, beaver dam analog, or actual beaver introduction, and have a very specific, accurate way of conveying that information to landowners, policymakers, and investors so that they can see what would happen if we did water restoration.
If you do this, if you do that, then this happens. Probably with this probability, and that happens after.
Right. And having it have a time series understanding over the next 50 years, here's what would happen on the water cycle.
Or here's what happens if you don't. That's also interesting. Like, what if you don't do the intervention? This is the downward facing slope of your landscape.
And basically just how I understand climate modeling and even atmospheric, land-based, ocean-based, they're still pretty broad strokes right now of recommendations that we can do. And so over the next 6 months to a year, we will be getting much, much more specific, but it's something I want to happen right now.
Yeah, because it's pretty, and then we get to Patrick, but it's pretty essential where you put your swale, where you plant your tree, where. And so, Patrick, what would you wish for if you had a magic wand?
Mine actually is pretty similar to Troy's in the sense that right now we're on a bit of a quest to find things. So this is really why we decided to build Biome in the first place, was that we looked out there at the existing citizen science apps and we just realized that they didn't have the capabilities we needed in order to gather the field data we need. So all manner of different tree information around species and diameter and height and forest canopy density and all that kind of thing would be amazing for all the different kind of biomes in the world. Definitely finding water features. So the existing, just to pick on dams because they're probably amongst the easier ones to detect, but the existing databases have 40,000, 60,000, maybe 100,000 dams worldwide. Apparently, there are estimates out there that there are roughly 16 million, at least 16 million small dams in the world. So there's a huge differential between the data sets that are out there.
That's enormous. Yeah.
And basically all the little dams that exist in the world.
So we don't know our water systems at all, basically.
Yeah, so we want to go find them all so that we can have more accurate models that can then tell you here's where you should actually build them.
And then take a lot of them away. Yeah. And how to build a dam and how high.
Yeah, so, and the second thing I would say would be that grand unified ecological modeling system. So we've seen parts of such a system implemented in the past. For instance, there's a paper I found, a bunch of researchers in Iran analyzing the land there because they have a kind of this water basin system that's very arid. And so they were trying to figure out, well, where should we build dams in order to maximize the water capture? And that is a really complex problem. You got to consider the precipitation patterns throughout the year. You've got to consider the runoff and the terrain of the land. You got to consider the absorption rate of the soil and the composition of the soil. And then you've got to consider factors like the cost and effectiveness of a dam in a given position on the water table. So they had 4 or 5 different machine learning methods that they composed together. And this was in quite a limited area. And so our dream is to have a grand unified version of that where anywhere in the world you can situate dam. We can tell you the optimal places to situate dams based on the effectiveness in terms of water that's collected and in terms of cost of construction and all of that. So we'll get there. You know, we have the necessary people on the team to get us there, but it's going to take time. And like Troy says, time is of the essence here. So if I could wave that magic wand, I'd say, give us the best possible data set for things like water interventions across the planet and soil samples and all the stuff that we hope to collect with the biomap. But just now, a bit of help with the modeling, you know, in terms of all the machine learning techniques necessary to kind of put that data to use in terms of predicting ecological systems behavior.
So what would you say? It feels like we're very early and at the same time very much along compared to 10 years ago or 50 years ago in this journey. To the investors listening, obviously without giving investment advice, but to the investors listening to this recording somewhere this year, next year, or whoever, or whenever, what would you tell them to focus on? Is that water side of things? Is that don't get too excited about carbon, but it's a very useful tool? Or visit XYZ? What would you advise investors to start looking into more?
That's a great question. I actually am still a little bit on your last question because, I sort of want to change my answer. So I'm going to change my answer and then answer this one. Because
go ahead.
The answer around water is also kind of abstract. Like we want to be able to measure things so that landowners can do this. Another story that stuck in my mind, I was talking with representatives of an Amazonian tribe a few weeks ago, and he said, we don't have any way to make money except selling our culture, right? Selling it through medicine work, essentially, ayahuasca tourism, and the sort of like wisdom traditions that they still hold that they can derive economic value of. And that's where they make their money now. And that's good in general. Like a lot of people benefit from that.
Compared to cutting down trees and forcing, yeah.
But what would really support them is where they could get paid for doing the ecological stewardship that they're already doing. And so rewarding stewards for the work that they're already doing, for the preservation, for the subtle things that we might not understand that's happening, just for being there as keystone species within an ecosystem to remain and continue a way of life that keeps human beings as part of the ecosystem. That would be a really amazing change. And so where people are able to get paid for ecological restoration, whether that's planting trees, whether that's just doing sort of like agroforestry and harvesting within a native landscape, which is restoring water cycles, which is being part of the citizen science app biome, where the people can just get paid for taking pictures of trees. That would fundamentally change hundreds of millions of livelihoods. So that's another thing. The answer to the investor question, what should we be looking at? I mean, there's a saying right now that all investment is climate investment right now. There's no way to make an investment in hard assets or in a tech company that doesn't take into consideration the very real changing status of ecosystems and climate change impacts over the coming decades. So broadly, everyone needs to be thinking about this. I'm a big believer in technological solutions, but I'm even a bigger believer in on the ground changes, because climate change is not a software problem. It's a physical problem, right? It's that there's an actual concrete imbalance in ecosystems. And so carbon finance will be a really big area. So de-risking the process for landowners to transition through regenerative agriculture, de-risking the process of deforestation. So that will require maybe trillions of dollars of project finance that will be highly, highly profitable. So if there are project finance people or infrastructure investors, we'll also be releasing ways to finance and de-risk these transitions through LandOS in future iterations of the platform. So one, come talk to us if you want to be a partner in that. The second is Earthshot Labs is raising a seed round right now. So if you are listening to this in mid 2021, give us a call. We're building the coolest group of shareholders on Earth that both share a deep care for the planet. So this is an impact story, but also a sense of rigor and scale that will make this a very profitable investment. And I would say the third category is doing actual on the ground restoration projects, because we see, as we talked about earlier, we see the biggest land arbitrage opportunity that has ever existed on the planet, because there are such degraded ecosystems that have sort of limited agricultural value. And I'm thinking Australia, Southwest Europe, the Western United States, many, many places throughout Central and West Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central America, places that have been so degraded over the last century that the economic value of carbon sequestration and conservation is actually a positive rate of return. And so to do conservation in a way that is sensitive to local people's livelihoods and multi-generational wealth and land stewardship, but to do conservation at a really large scale, we'll see massive, massive opportunities both for investors and for grant making and nonprofit work. What we see is that there's just not enough money in philanthropy right now to actually go address the size of the problem. So that's why we are inviting investors to look at this problem, because, hey, if you can make a positive rate of return while doing conservation or stacked agroforestry, conservation forestry, where you're essentially getting agricultural products, carbon credits, and long-term forestry projects that eventually end up with an old growth forest, that's what we can see a lot of ecosystems transitioning into.
And what about you, Patrick? Where would you point people to that are interested to get involved by investing their own wealth or wealth they're managing?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, first of all, just to consider the context here. I mean, we're facing the greatest challenge that humanity has ever encountered. And now is the time. The next 10 years are very, very critical in terms of really standing up to that challenge. And so do you want to be a part of that? Do you as an investor want to play your part to be a part of the story that people are going to tell about how humanity got together and really countered this challenge? I think there's something here for everybody, right? If you're an early stage venture tech investor, there are tons of really innovative people out there. There's many, many different instances of people like us who step away from a career, or I would say, speaking for myself, who step away from careers at tech giants and at investment funds, and are really looking to use our talents in ways that essentially serve the environment and to serve facing this challenge. And so everywhere you look, there are new startups that are thinking of innovative ways to counter climate change and to restore nature. But also, if you're, let's say, a mezzanine or a secondary debt lender, there's tons of opportunity there in terms of getting involved with land restoration. And, that's where we'll be in a couple of years, is raising significant amounts of capital in order to go and do things at planetary scale once we have our technology platform really built out. So there's something there for everyone. I do think that there's a lot of innovation that's going to be happening around things like restoring soil health and things like really doing the specific forms of innovative intervention, whether drawing from indigenous knowledge or using the latest material science, but there's just a lot out there. And I think it's a case of not thinking about this as being some kind of ESG kind of concessionary investing, and more, this is the next technology wave. This is the next great wave of innovation and economic opportunity. And like Troy was saying, at this point, everything has an element of climate in it. So why not dive in and be a core part of that solution?
Thank you both so much for your time. I think that's a perfect moment to end. I don't think it's the last time we'll be talking, and I'm looking forward to checking in over time as this develops and unfolds in ways we cannot predict yet. But thank you for a very positive episode, which is not always the case. And it's very nice to see the vision, the potential of land, and potentially the largest arbitrage or carbon arbitrage the world has ever seen. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, real pleasure. Really enjoyed the conversation.
If you found the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast valuable, there are a few simple ways you can use to support it. Number 1, rate and review the podcast on your podcast app. That's the best way for other listeners to find the podcast, and it only takes a few seconds. Number 2, share this podcast on social media or email it to your friends and colleagues. Number 3, if this podcast has been of value to you, and if you have the means, please join my membership community to help grow this platform and allow me to take it further. You can find all the details on gumroad.com/investingregenag or in the description below. Thank you so much, and see you at the next podcast. Dear friends of the podcast, I'm super excited to share with you the online video course Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food. How to put money to work in regenerating soils at scale and growing a lot of tasty food while doing it. Why are we doing this course? After 100 interviews and more than 100 hours of audio asking the question how to put money to work in regenerating soils, and have been following the space since 2011 and recording these podcasts since 2016, we thought it was time to share our lessons learned. What have we seen in the space over the last years? How have we built our decision-making framework? What to focus on with the podcast? How have we picked interviewees? And what questions should you ask? What is happening in the space? What should you read? What should you listen? What should you watch? How to approach this space? For whom is this course? You, the soil builders and investors in this space. The soil builders, people working in this space, entrepreneurial farmers, fund managers, vehicle builders, crowd investing, platform builders, ag-tech companies, farm-to-gut food companies, permaculture, keyline designers, holistic management consultants, etc., etc. People that are building soil at scale. And the investors who are putting their own money to work through their family office or as private individuals, or people who are putting other people's money to work through foundations, institutional capital, banks, insurance companies, etc. Is this course free? No. This is pay what you think it's worth. Meaning I have no way of knowing what this course will be worth to you. And I'm very aware that among the listeners of this podcast, we have people with very different means. So I'm inviting you, if this course is creating value to you, and if you have the means, to consider paying what you think it's worth. Thank you. So what is this course? It's currently a series of 17 videos, mostly ranging from 10 to 15 minutes, plus PDF slides, so you don't have to ride along. We're gonna look into why invest in regenerative agriculture and why extractive agriculture is so risky, how to invest, what kind of frameworks you could and I think should build, what to invest in, what kind of co-investors you could find, or what kind of investors you could find if you're a soil builder. Every lesson will have a digging deeper part where I will share what kind of reports, what kind of interviews, what kind of videos you can look into if you want to dig deeper. We're going to look at nutrient density, landscape design, and a lot more. So what is it not? It's not a list of investable deals. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist in this world. We're really at the beginning of the regenerative agriculture and food revolution. It's also not investment advice. Before making any investment, please find professional investment advice. So get ready, get a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, or whatever you're drinking. Click on the link below, sign up, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback.